let me introduce you to the spiritual rivals of Jellycat. Pom pals, and I say rivals, but I think they'd be friends. And I call them spiritual rivals because they're the only doll line that I've come across that are super cute and that also have a super wide variety of unique designs. I can tell you that I really want this Mothman. And after making a brick doll last time, I realized there was one other category of dolls that I don't really come across often. Computers. And so for this video, that's exactly what I'm going to make. Hi, my name is Emily and I'm an amateur doll maker.
The first thing I have to do is design the doll. Of course, we need to retain the signature pom pal face, and for the back, I want a round semicircle shape with maybe some vents in it. And then I began drafting up a pattern using one of the dolls for size reference. Ooh, real quick, let me introduce you to my collection. First up, we have Gooey Glue. Next up, we have Prissy. And last but not least, we have Pinky. Everybody say hi! Anyway, back to the pattern. Here I am drafting up the front shell, and I was having trouble drawing right angles, so I used the computer instead. And then I went about marking out where I would trim these seams to reduce bulk. I'm sure this makes sense to nobody but me, but let me cut it out and maybe that'll make more sense. I don't think this is gonna make sense until I actually start sewing everything, so let's just draw the rest of the patterns and move on. Using that front piece, I extrapolated the dimensions of the rest of the pattern pieces. I trimmed the corners on those as well, although the haphazard angles I did them in were a little tricky to work with down the road. I made this one a little less square and more rectangular, and then I realized I forgot to add a seam allowance on the flat side of the butt, so I went ahead and did that. And now the only thing left to do is to cut this out in fabric and see how everything comes together. Since this was V1 and I was very much experimenting, I dug out this gray hoodie that I had already cut up, Silence of the Lambs style. This was very old and pilly, so I wouldn't feel bad if I messed anything up. For the screen, I decided to use felt in the alluring azure of the blue screen of death. And then I just cut everything out. So basically the first sewing step is to fold this inwards and then top stitch it to the blue screen of death. And speaking of the blue screen, before we do any sewing, we actually have to apply the face. To make the face, I'm going to be using this Sizer Easy Puff Heat Transfer Vinyl. As the name suggests, unlike normal vinyl, this one puffs up when you iron it, so I'm really excited to try it out. See, that's how puffy it's supposed to get. It says not to use it with a normal iron, but that's all I have, so I don't have a choice. I quickly whipped out a design and cut it out. Well, I wanted to get some aesthetic shots of the crooked cutting, but you can't really see anything on this white vinyl. And here I am trying the heat puff for the first time. And while the iron was hot, I also pressed down the inner seam allowances on the front and back pieces with the hope it'll make sewing more manageable. Now we're going to top stitch this down. Stitching up here is a little wonky, but that's what V2 is for. Look how cute! Look how sad! Next I'm gonna connect the face to the rim. First I'm sewing this into a loop, and then carefully lining up these notches with the corners. This would definitely be more precise if I cut the notches to the same angle as the corners. V2, V2. I did want to add feet as all pom pals have, but after observing the feet for a while, I got a little overwhelmed and decided to skip it for V1. Next, let's put the butt together. Speaking of butts, Milo, I'm going to stay stitch and notch these side curved pieces. Now pin the curved edge to the long side of this rectangle. Now we're attaching the butt piece to this backing piece. Once again, I matched up the notches and corners, and once again, this would be easier if they were in the same angle, but I pressed ahead and sewed everything together. And finally, we can attach this to the face. I left the bottom unsewn for the purposes of turning inside out and stuffing. It's cute, don't get me wrong, it's very cute. But it's not a pom pal if it doesn't have legs. And also, it's just so plain in the back, so I think I'm going to add some vents of some sort. Just some lines that I can either embroider on or use crooked vinyl to stick on. And maybe I'll make the face bigger as well, because look how small it is compared to gooey glue over here. But the size of it is good. The general shape of it I'm very happy with. I think I could have stuffed it a little more. And then comes a segment I call Emily Struggles to Understand Feet. I made pattern after pattern, mock-up after mock-up, but I just could not comprehend how to make it so perfectly spherical. They just kept coming out stumpy and stubby when I needed them to be round. I'm starting to think that maybe orbular shapes are a little too advanced for me. Also, I realized a fatal flaw. Listen to this. There are poly beads inside gooey glue, so that means I should put poly beads inside Computer Guy as well. You want to be filled with poly beads, don't you? I began making notes for improvement. That included feet, if I ever managed to figure them out, back details, using a light blue felt for the blushies, adding interfacing so the shapes have more definition and structure, and lastly, ideally I would like to make this out of a fabric that isn't this filled up gray hoodie fabric, so next time I go to the thrift store, I'll keep an eye out.
Here is what I got. It is a gray fuzzy throw that I got for $3. I've seen this kind of blanket a lot in thrift stores. I don't know why. And the other side, very interestingly, has this wave-like Ripley pattern. It's kind of like a Zen garden. I was thinking maybe we could utilize this for some extra texture on the little computer.
There's a big scratch running down one side of it. I guess that's a pulled thread, and that's probably the reason why it got donated. But since I'm just using it to make other things, I don't really mind. Before we move on, I just wanted to show y'all this really cute sweater I also got. I really love the sheep motif, and so did my cats. For V2, I decided to digitize the entire pattern. I was thinking that the way I went around the screen might be a little too convoluted, so I was looking at PomPal's website to look for inspiration. Gadget robot, worth looking at. This rocket window, let's take a look. So I think the entire surface area is basically just embroidered on, which I obviously can't do because I don't have an embroidery machine. But what I can do is just apply a piece of fabric and then zigzag all the way around the fabric. But yeah, same for the rocket ship too. Also, look at this. If you leave the tab, it tells you to come back. With that figured out, I got to printing out my pristine new pattern pieces and cutting them out. For the rim piece and the back piece, I originally planned to have them cut on a fold for ease, but doing this on a thick fabric added too much discrepancy to the measurements, so I wouldn't recommend this unless you were working with a thin fabric like felt. It was a very grisly affair to cut this fuzzy fabric. I know there are techniques to cutting furry fabrics, such as using a razor blade or just ripping it apart, but I don't think either would have worked for me in this case. For most of these pieces, I'm gonna use the flat gray side, but for the rim piece, I'm going to use the textured side, just for a bit of spice. Before we get to attaching these together, I'm first going to reinforce the gray piece with some, upside down, fusible interfacing, and then I'm going to use some heat and bond to hold the felt in place to ensure it doesn't slip when we're embroidering. And yes, I know that in the notes for V2, I said I was going to add interfacing to all the pieces. But once I got the fuzzy fabric, I realized ironing it would make it less fluffy, and I wanted to retain the fluff. You can see in this clip that the fur became very flat and almost scruffy, and I didn't want that to happen to the entire doll. Once that had all cooled down, I went on to embroidering the edges, for which I'm using the zigzag stitch on my machine. I did a little practice and then took a deep breath and began embroidering the real thing. Okay, here we go. Ta-da! This looks so legit. There's some spots where the stitch kind of skipped. I think maybe I was pulling the fabric a little too hard. And in the corner here, you can see some of the felt is poking out. But considering that this is my first time, I think I did pretty well. Now let's get a redesigned face onto there. Something happened to the heat puff. It looks like brains. Ugh. And so I peeled it all off. Let's go through these instructions more thoroughly. Set iron dial between cotton and linen. Cover design with heat transfer cover sheet. I don't have that. Or multi-purpose paper. I guess I do have that. Place on hard flat surface. Iron with medium firm pressure for 10 to 15 seconds. Then peel carrier hot or cold. It's definitely a lot smoother, but it's not as puffy. It's basically flat. This heat puff thing is more finicky than I thought. This round of heat puff was sadly impossible to peel, and so I made a mental note to fix this in V3 and moved on to the plushies. Now let's assemble the rest of this. Unfortunately, the machine really did not like the fuzzy fabric, and so I had to make the executive decision to hand sew everything. Double unfortunately, after I sewed on the rim, I realized I forgot to attach the feet, and I really did not want to undo what I just did. But on the topic of the foot, I opted to go for a much simpler semicircle shape instead of a three-dimensional orb. One of these days, I'll figure out how spheres work. Continuing with my hand sewing, I put together the butt piece. Now we attach the butt to the back frame, and I'm going to do that while watching TV. And then I pinned the front and back together to create this concrete flower, and once I flipped that inside out, a computer was born. Ta-da! As previously mentioned, I'm only going to fill the top half with stuffing. The rest I'm going to fill with this sack of poly pellets that I bought years ago just in case I needed it one day. And hey, I wasn't wrong. I sewed up a little pouch to contain the beads and then closed up the bottom hole, and after that, V2 was done. The proportions of the face are definitely way better, and I definitely like the fuzzy fabric a lot more. It's not as fluffy as the Pompel one, but I think it does the trick. I love the embroidered edge on this. It looks very professional. I think the biggest trouble I had with this was that because the fabric was so floppy and I didn't have any interfacing on it, it was really hard to get any cuts to be very precise. So you can see some of the stitch lines, like it's wider here and narrower here, and that makes it look less professional. I'm debating if for V3 I should apply interfacing regardless of the fact it makes it less fluffy. And of course I gotta change out the eyeballs. And of course the little feet, can't forget the feet. Oh yeah, and I'm going to nix using the textured side on the rim piece because it just makes it look kind of unruly and messy. Alright, time for V3. Based on what I read online, laying down a towel when ironing helps the fabric retain its fluff, as well as lowering the temperature and pressure on the iron. Of course, that means the interfacing might not have the strongest of bonds, but I just want the fabric to be fluffy, man. Also on the rim, I added a seam allowance on the fold edge, so now I can simply cut out two pieces and sew them together, rather than dealing with cutting on a fold. Milo! I made a lot of changes to the face. For the eyes, I used doll eyes that I sanded down first. I'm gonna be honest, I really did not expect there to be sanding in this project. and then painted white, and then glossed with Mod Podge. The mouth I hand embroidered, and later I also used light blue thread to hand embroider the edges of the blushies. And then I gave it some feet. I know that for thick fabrics, you should use clips instead of pins to avoid warping. I've just been using pins this whole time, which mostly worked out fine, but in this specific instance, I really needed some clips. I also know that these are not the ideal clips to use, but I gotta work with what I got.
Now we're just going to stitch across like this along the seam allowance line.
Before sewing though, I stuffed the feet so they could be as three-dimensional as possible. If you're using this video as some kind of tutorial, Godspeed with that, I would advise that you embroider the border of the face before you attach the feet because... But thankfully, I did manage to get through it. When attaching the rim to the front, make sure the feet are sandwiched between the two. And once again, I am hand sewing this because I just find it easier for something so small. You might have noticed that in V2, I didn't add any vents to the back, and that's because I forgot. But I remembered this time, and before sewing the butt pieces together, I machine embroidered 3 horizontal stripes on each side piece.
Did I just make the Krusty Krab? So in terms of sewing this together in preparation for stuffing, I'm doing things a little differently this time. So instead of leaving the bottom open like the previous 2 iterations, I'm leaving the top open so that when I pour in the beans, they can settle in safely at the bottom, and then I can stuff the rest without feeling like the beans are gonna spill out.
And so it was pellet time.
Look at its little legs.
And oh, this is me trying to explain that I'm not making a pouch for the pellets this time. I found that in the previous version where I did use a pouch, it made the doll very hard and not at all cuddly and inviting like a real palm pail. So loose pellets it was.
Now let's sew this up.
And with that, the final version of the computer doll is done. Hold on to thy buttocks because it is time for the final reveal.
I've literally just been holding it in my hands like this while watching a video. It's just, it fits so perfectly in your hands.
By the way, if you'd like to make your own Chrissy computer, I will have the digital pattern available on Etsy for a limited time, depending on how many people are actually interested in it. Go forth and make your own bean bud and tag me on Instagram so I can see it. Hope you enjoy!